Okay, today is October 29, 2013. This is Forensic Interviewing of Children. We just went over the midterm examination, and we're going to begin learning Unit 5 in just a moment. We kind of went back in time to learning Unit 3. We were examining comparatives, and I was making the observation that, some words require a comparison to something that's known in order for us to understand what that word means when interviewing a child. Usually words of size and duration, words like that, big, small, fast, slow, short. You need to compare it to something or someone. The little girl in the video entitled Comparatives and Need Dolls was trying to explain the height, tall or short, to the interviewer of a person who was involved in a molestation event with her. And Fran, the interviewer, was asking about whether he was tall or short. And we just made the observation that it would have been more helpful if the interviewer said, was he taller than you, little girl, the subject of the interview, or shorter than you? And then we could have went from there. But there's someone else that the little girl mentions that also could have given us a point of comparison so that we could focus in more and more on who the person is that she's speaking of, since we don't know exactly who that is in this group molest. Did she mention a third party? Does someone remember the third party she mentioned? Say it.
Julio.
Julio. Does someone remember what she said about the third party? Julio's tall. Fran's going, is he tall or short? And the girl is putting her hand above her head, and then she gets down, and she puts her hand below her head, and she waffles a little. I don't know what all that gesticulation means, all the moving of the arms and everything. But I do know she says, Julio's tall. Aha! Bring me Julio. Bring me Julio. The next question could have been what? Remember, we're trying to find out the relative size, the comparative size of the target, the unknown molester, we'll call him. Right? So we want to know how big, tall, fat, skinny the unknown molester is, right? We now know that Julio's tall, right? So what do we want to ask her next? About unknown molester. We'll call it Jimmy. Jimmy's the guy who touched her. What would you ask her about Jimmy if you want to get some sense of his size, at least the beginning of calculating his size? Yeah, you look at, yes, is he taller than Julio or shorter than Julio? I mean, she gave us a nice declarative. Now, Julio's tall. Okay, well, is Jimmy taller than Julio or shorter than Julio? Right? So now we go find Julio, we get a tape measure, and we figure out how tall Julio is. And then we can only look for dudes taller than Julio or shorter than Julio. We can rule out a whole group of the universe. Because when you're looking, and here we'll find the group of boys. And among that group, we may be able to figure out who's who. Go ahead.
Never mind.
Okay. I'm going to play it again, and you'll see.
I wonder if...
He's like a short guy. Julio's tall. Right. So, who's Julio?
Yeah, who is Julio?
I don't know. We don't know. That's the question she should ask. Who is Julio? And where is he? And how do I get him in the room so I can measure him? Now, what's happening here, and we'll talk more about this in a little while, is the mechanics of the molest issue. Excuse me, like, how did he do it? This comes up a lot. Well, if he reached around the car seat and put his hand down your blouse, how could that happen if the console was in between you? In sexual assault cases, the mechanics of how the molest or the sexual assault occurred are often relevant and in play and the subject of questioning by lawyers. And that's kind of what Fran's focusing on right here now, because something, we don't have the whole thing here. It's a little bit unfair to Fran because it's totally out of context. We took a 2-minute little clip here, and there's a bunch of talk before this, and certainly there's talk after that. But, something in Fran's mind said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. How could he get his penis into her vagina or her vaginal area if the guy was taller and she was shorter? And we don't know exactly what the body positioning was because we don't see that in the clip. But obviously that occurred earlier. And now Fran's puzzled. So she asks, and I think the child does a nice job of explaining how this could have happened the way she said earlier, despite the disparity in size, which we still don't even have a good sense of. And there's some real effective way to deal with this, and I put the text on the video, so I can't even ask you. Now, it sounds like she uses the phrase crunch down. What might be a reasonable inference for what she's expressing? Instead of crunch down, what do you think she's trying to say? What do catchers do in baseball? Go ahead. Crouch down, squat, but I think we have a auditory discrimination error here, right? Crouch down. I think she meant crouch down. She said crunch down, and the word crouch may have, she may interpret that word to mean crunch down. And that it kind of feels right here. Again, we're taking it out of context, but she seems to explain herself well because I think Fran's saying, well, if they're both standing and he's putting his penis on her private, he's much taller than her, it would make sense that his private would be able to get on her private based upon their differences in size. And she says he crouched down and was doing stuff. Now that makes sense. The crouching down kind of creates a state of equilibrium or equalness, if you will. But there could have been I like the demonstration. I like that the child got down and showed with her own body. And this is, you'll hear about this later, but what could she have done that you're going to be taught about later in this course? What did I say in the text on the video?
Told me?
No, there was letters on the video a little while ago. It said try what? Did anybody see it? Try dolls? It said try dolls. Funny how the human brain works, huh? Let's.
I'm wondering if he was taller than you, how did his private part reach your private part?
Sometimes
You know what? It's blurred out. That's why. And it was there for, like, subliminally. It says try dolls there. See? You can't see it from back there. Anyway, dolls would help, anatomical dolls, and I'll teach you about that later. But now, the child's made a statement about abuse. With the doll, she could show us the body positioning and answer that question that's troubling the interviewer about the mechanics of the sexual event, how the body positioning was. And you see how the auditory discrimination error comes into play in a real-life interview? Here's a video that we didn't get to look at about pronouns and kinship terms. We didn't get to look at it in here. You looked at it at home. And again, these things are very ambiguous, very problematic for kids. That's why we recommend using proper nouns and not pronouns if we can avoid it. The problem with pronouns and their close cousins' kinship terms, no pun intended, is that they are inherently ambiguous and often difficult to follow. Unless you connect them up with a proper noun or a proper name, they have no meaning. So they can be confusing for children and sometimes even for adults. Watch how this interviewer struggles somewhat. Now, kinship terms and pronoun terms present problems and challenges and difficulties for children in a way that's similar to comparatives, because comparatives, big, small, fast, tall, all that stuff. You need to link it up to Julio. You need to link it up to her. You need to compare in order to get a good understanding, right? Well, here, if you got a he or a she or a they or an it or a cousin or a grandma, those words have no meaning unless you connect it up to the he to whoever the he is, the it to whoever the it is, the she or the they to those people too. So it's similar in that aspect that the words are ambiguous, okay? And in order to make sense of it, you need to connect it up to something else. Now, when you say, well, cousins and grandma, sometimes kids have 3 grandmas, 4 grandmas in the same case. Grandma's cousin, uncle, is a form of pronoun. It's a substitute for the proper name. You give me an uncle, he's got a first name and a last name. You give me a grandma, she got something there. Now, kids aren't going to go, Martha Davis. They're not going to say that, so you're probably going to use grandma. But I'm going to call her Grandma Martha. You'll see later when we do the family circles. in the protocol that I'm going to teach you, you might call her, we're going to call her Grandma Martha or Grandma Jane or something like that, if it's relevant. If there's only one grandma, you may not have to go there. The point is, don't think that kinship terms are not vague. They can be. Now here, this child's very competent, not a problem with that. In fact, she's able to express herself supremely well, and it's not her inability to understand, her being the child, I used a female pronoun, it's not, we'll call her Daniela, it's not Daniela's inability to express herself or to understand, it's just the fact that there's a lot of relatives in this equation, so things get a little tangled, and kinship issues can create entanglement when you're interviewing a kid. Listen to how the interviewer struggles.
This interviewer struggles somewhat.
Anita, she came back. Dorney? Dooney came back.
Because Dooney is the husband of Denny.
Dooney is the husband
Yeah, of Denny.
of Denny?
Yeah.
Okay.
The husband of Dooney is Denny.
Okay.
And the mother of Denny is Anita.
Oh, okay, I gotcha. So Dooney came back.
Yes, and then she said.
So substitute Paul for your cousin and use Carla instead of she, right? You want to use the proper nouns whenever you can. We looked at the video on children and agency, or did we? No, we didn't, I don't think. The issue here is, and we talked about this in the language slides, but the issue here is children have a very rigid view of agency. By rigid, I mean they're very concrete about that. They don't see the shades of gray and that, saying Billy put his mouth on Billy put his mouth on Uncle Sam's penis, or Uncle Sam put his penis in Billy's mouth, that we kind of mean the same thing here. Children can be very precise about that. They're very precise about who the agent is and the doer. I think we talked about that, who's doing the action. And this child is it's very clear to her that she's not the agent, she's not the doer here, she's not the one who's doing something, that it's, I think, her uncle. And they're like that because linguistically they have a rigid view of agency, but they also worry about, at this girl's age, about complicity. By complicity, I mean that she's involved, if she wanted to do it. And in this case, she has to masturbate her uncle, I think. It's a masturbation, I think the relationship is an uncle. And she don't want it to be the facts that she did this. Even if she did it, she's blameless and innocent. But kids don't, they don't appreciate that. They may think that since I did the affirmative act, I must have liked it, or I did it on purpose, or something like that. So, at this age, they're very concerned about whether they're going to be perceived as the initiator of sexual contact in some way. So that's as much in play as her rigid view of agency. I didn't masturbate him. He made me do it. This was not something I wanted to do. I was not complicit. Watch.
Did he have anything on under his robe? No. Okay, so where did he put your hand? When?
On his private.
On his private? Okay, this part you call his private? Okay. So what happened after you put your hand on his private?
He grabbed it and then I told him to stop, and then
I didn't put my hand on his private. He grabbed it, and I told him to stop. Now, there's two things at work there that really tell me, as an expert in this stuff, that she's concerned about complicity, right? He grabbed it. Again, she's making to Fran, the question was the same. After you put your hand on his private under his robe, she's like, wait a minute, I'm going to clarify. I didn't put my hand on his private under his robe. He grabbed it. Again, I'm theorizing she's worried about complicity, that somehow she's involved. And what really confirms in my mind that my theory is correct is, and I told him to what? Stop. I wasn't part of this. I want to know part of this. And, by the way, interviewer, I told him to stop, that this was not something I wanted to be doing. All right, any questions about any of that stuff? Now we're going to take a look at how children experience abuse. And this is very, very important for an interviewer, because we have to understand what it's like to be a child who's sexually exploited if we're going to do a competent interview of a child. Because often what we think about human behavior, and especially children's behavior, isn't the way children act. They act in a way that is inconsistent with our expectations. They do things that we puzzle about. You know, I kept using the example a few weeks ago about the girl who kept going to the chess club and then re-signed up for the chess club after she was molested, okay? And I use that in the context of asking why questions. You know, that would be a question where you want to get into, is there a reason why after he fondled you all of the first semester, that in the second semester you signed up for chess again with the same chess teacher? So we talked about how to ask that why question in a way that's not so accusatory to the child. Well, that's an example of a child acting in a way that's inconsistent with the way we think they should act. Most of us, if we were, without our permission, without our consent, sexually fondled by a person who's bigger and stronger than us and more experienced than us, wouldn't go back and put ourselves in that harm's way again. We wouldn't take chess again. That's what logic tells us. But children who are sexually abused, especially kids who are sexually abused by someone they trust or love or care about, or they're stuck with. In that case, the girl wasn't stuck with him. That's what makes it a bit odd. But children who live in families are stuck. It's their dad, it's their uncle, it's the mom's brother who lives in the same house. They don't have a lot of options and opportunity to keep themselves safe. So they do things that seem illogical and peculiar to us because we don't really focus on the lack of options. And we're going to look at that in depth in a moment. Okay? The thing that I can say to you about the chess kid that she's probably experiencing but would never tell us is there may have been aspects of it that she liked, that were pleasing to her. You know, we can't lose sight of the fact that sexual contact is pleasurable most of the time, right? It's stimulating. It makes us feel good. Children feel good. When you stimulate the nerve endings in the genitalia, there's a positive response. Now, children that are prepubertal and little, they don't understand what that feeling is, the ramifications of that feeling, you know, the disparity in relationship, the negativity that surrounds all that, and the criminality. They don't really appreciate all that. We do. That's why we lock people up and put them in prison, deservedly so, who take advantage of kids sexually, especially prepubertal children. They don't get all that stuff as well as grown-ups do, that's for sure. But there's a sense of like, this isn't right, I shouldn't be doing this, confusion. The younger they are, there's more confusion. The older they are, the more they realize that this isn't normal, and society rejects this kind of interaction between adults and children. But getting back to the central point here is it still feels good, you know? It still could feel good, and most of the time does feel good. So it's a very confusing thing for kids. If on the one hand they know it's wrong, they shouldn't be doing it, but he is their teacher, and it kind of feels good, and it's ambiguous. Now rest assured, the chess teacher didn't, lay her on the table or perform, overt, direct, obvious sexual assault. I mean, this was in the line of feels, touches, tickles, frotteurism. He has his hand on her, and he's getting sexual pleasure from it, and he's touching her body parts, but it's under the guise of helping her, tickling her, fooling around with her, rather than an obvious painful act. So the touching by the chess teacher might have had a pleasurable aspect to it, but she will never tell us that. Okay. She'll never tell us that. Most kids won't tell us that. The real younger kids will. I don't know if the clip's here or did you see the clip where the little girl, Giselle, says, "How did it feel in your body?" And the little girl goes, "It felt good." The girl was about 4. Well, since it's relevant, let's see. It might even be in Now, there's two things at work here, and we'll see other examples of this. The one thing I'm trying to express to you is that it feels good on children's bodies, and that good feeling, because of the nerve endings and the way human sexuality works, can be confusing for little kids, and especially for latency age kids, grade school age kids, and teenagers. You know, I prosecuted a physician, a general practitioner from Woodland Park, or then it was West Patterson, in the mid-1990s, and he sexually molested, well, I prosecuted him for molesting 39 patients, but there were probably many more than that. And many of the women that we interviewed and that were the victims of my prosecution struggled with the fact that they derived sexual pleasure from the doctors sexually touching them when they were being examined. Now, he didn't say he was examining them. He claimed to be putting this medicine on their genitalia and a number of other acts of deception to the women. They thought there was something wrong with them, that the good doctor was simply putting medicine on their vagina, or really on their labia and their clitoris, and he was just trying to help them, and then they had a physiological response. And I'd say about, out of the 39 women that we interviewed, I'd say about a good 10 or 11 of them were sexually stimulated, at least one or two orgasms, okay? So, you know, despite the context, right, there's nerve endings, it feels good, you know, and it can create a physiological, a biological, a body response. Well, how do you think kids feel about that, right? How do they process that? Well, they're ill-equipped to process that. You know, on the one hand, it feels really good. You know, these kids that are molested, part of the reason that they sometimes put themselves in that context again is because there's that good feeling associated with it. You know, they desired it. Does it make, you know, it doesn't make it okay, right? But it's a very confusing thing for the children. So here you're going to see a little girl say that very thing. Look how little she is.
Did Timmy touch you on a place on your body?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? What happened?
He touched my vagina.
He touched your vagina. How did it feel when Timmy touched your vagina?
Good.
Good? Yeah?
See? How did it feel when Timmy touched your vagina? Good. What's interesting is this child is, 4 years old, 5 years old, and it's no big deal to her. Not too confusing for her because she's so young, right? It's as kids grow and grow older that we they begin to appreciate that these things are wrong, and there is all kinds of stigma and issues associated with that good feeling. But this child is so innocent, so naive, that it's being processed just physically by her. And that's why, as a good interviewer, you have to be prepared. Even you can tell in Giselle's voice a little bit, good. She didn't flip out like, good? I'm sure about that? Tell me more. Good. It felt good. I could see people wanting to, at least go in that direction or thinking that way, but that's not the right way to go. Your affect needs to be neutral always, no matter how odd or illogical or implausible or startling the response of the child is. Now, Giselle's the interviewer here. She doesn't do any of that. Nevertheless, you can just a little bit of good. Is this a little bit of puzzlement in her voice? Because I know her well and I know how she talks. Listen.
Did Timmy touch you on a place on your body?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? What happened?
He touched my vagina.
He touched your vagina. How did it feel when Timmy touched your vagina?
Good.
Good? Yeah? We're good.
Not so much, but a little bit in there. But for the most part, she's totally, Giselle is totally calm and neutral and doesn't telegraph anything about how she feels about that statement. All right, we'll have to talk about that. I'll show you that one next week. The girl is asking the interviewer if she's going to get in trouble for talking about what happened to her. Okay? What's that?
Project number 2.
Stu, yeah.
It's going to be due next week, right?
No, it was due today.
You said the 4th.
Oh, the 4th? Then it's due the 4th. Whatever I said. I don't remember. I got so many classes. I put it on there.
Yeah, next week, yeah.
All right, let's dig into the dynamics of sexual abuse. You know, I started out by talking a moment ago why it's important to understand how kids think, that it might have felt good to them, how confusing a time it can be. And by understanding the dynamics of sexual abuse, we can help us understand how that kid feels about what happens and the kind of coping strategies that kids go through. Okay? Now, the landmark article in the field here is the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, and that's where you're going to apply what Dr. Summit talks about. There's another article, too, among your readings by Finkelhor, 2 articles for that Jane Doe assignment, which is due on November 4th, as I was just reminded. You're going to read those articles if you haven't already, and then take a look at Jane Doe's narrative, the handwritten statement she made to the police about her life, the parts of it that she remembered and expressed in that handwritten statement, and look for elements of her life story, so to speak, and the behavioral dynamics that Summit talks about in this landmark article, as well as the dynamics that Professor Finkelhor talks about in his article, which both of them, well, Finkelhor wrote it with others. Summit wrote this as the only author. And the goal of Dr. Summit was, in the 1980s, the goal was to help other therapists and clinicians understand the psychological aspects of intrafamilial abuse, primarily father-daughter incest. The context in which he wrote this article was about father-daughter incest. But the same kinds of dynamics happen in any case where the perpetrator is someone who has supervisory power over the child, where the child is subordinate to the perpetrator. And the classic example of a child being subordinate to the perpetrator is the daughter in a father-daughter incest case. But it could be the uncle, it could be, at times it could be the field hockey coach, it could be a teacher in school, somebody who has to answer to the grown-up in some way. The most difficult situation for any child is when they are a victim of their caregiver, either their father, their stepfather, or their mother. So Summit writes about how kids react, the kinds of coping mechanisms, and the kind of cognitive processing that goes on in their brain when they're molested by someone that they trust and someone that they are subordinate to. And he called that article the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. And again, the main reason he wrote that article was for other therapists, because even therapists weren't getting it. The kid would come in session 5 and then recant. They'll take the whole allegation back. And some therapists in the 1980s thought that that was evidence that it didn't happen. Or the child may be inconsistent or leave out big parts of what happened to them. And the therapist might think, well, maybe the kid isn't being truthful, or maybe the child isn't being honest. Maybe there's something suspicious about these statements. Even therapists in the 1980s had a hard time appreciating the psychological dynamics that kids go through when they're molested by someone they know, trust, and love. So he wrote this article to help therapists better understand the psychology of victimization in incest and quasi-incest cases, incest-like cases, uncles and teachers and coaches and dads and stepdads and the like. What happened was lawyers got a hold of this article and they began to use it, especially prosecutors, in thinking about how their victims process the molestation and how that understanding might help juries and family court judges understand why kids do and say what they do when they are molested by someone they love and trust and has supervision over them. So what started out as an article for therapists and clinicians and psychologists to help them better understand what kids go through turned out to be one of the landmark legal articles in the field, where today we put on experts to explain what kids go through so juries understand how kids react to abuse and neglect, especially sexual abuse. This is all about sexual abuse, so that they don't automatically consider that odd and peculiar and counterintuitive behavior against the child. Counterintuitive means contrary to intuition, the opposite of what we think should happen. Okay? Counterintuitive. Intuitive is a form of the word intuition. So this article is an attempt at explaining the illogical aspects of children's behavior when they're sexually molested. They don't tell somebody. They endure it. When they do tell, they tell a little bit of it. Or often they deny it 1, 2, maybe 3 times. And then they say it happened. And they say, well, it didn't happen that way. It wasn't that bad. I did say it happened, but it really didn't happen. All of these kind of statements would be easily used by someone who was investigating whether this occurred or not as evidence that the child is overstating it, misstating it, or out and out lying. So, the syndrome has 5 categories, if you will. And the way to remember it, if you're taking the examination later, is think of the mnemonic she doctor. That may help you remember the categories. She doctor, you see the column, SHEDR. Secrecy, helplessness, entrapment and accommodation, delayed or unconvincing disclosure, and retraction. And we'll take a look at what that all means right now. Summit teaches us that the syndrome has 2 preconditions. And the first 2 aspects of the syndrome are really the foundation for abuse. That's the setup. Secrecy and helplessness. Okay? If you don't have, that's why he calls them preconditions. If you don't have secrecy and helplessness, you're not going to have molestation. You're not going to have incest. There won't be a child molestation. But the 2 things that form the preconditions are inherent in the father-daughter relationship, in the parent-child relationship. These things happen in homes. They happen in someone's house. They don't happen in the open. They don't happen in the street. They don't happen in the parking lot of Willowbrook Mall or Woodbridge Center. They happen in a private home with the door shut and the shades pulled down. Secrecy is part of the experience of a child and their victimization within the family. So you have that precondition. If it wasn't a secret, the molester would be found out, and it couldn't happen, right? So it has to happen in secret. And the other thing that's inherent in the father-daughter relationship and the parent-child relationship is helplessness, right? Helplessness. The victim is helpless by definition. They're a child. By definition, they are subordinate to their caregiver. The very person that they would turn to for help if they were in trouble or they were injured, or somebody did something uncomfortable to them, or something scary to them. The very person that they would wake up in the morning from when they have night terrors, or they wet their bed, or they're scared about bullies at school, or whatever their problems are, the very person that they reach out to for comfort, for solace, the very person they reach out to be embraced is the person who's molesting them. So they're helpless. By definition, they're helpless. They're living in a familial context where the person who is there to care for them betrays that and molests them. So by definition, they are molested in a secret context in a way that is very difficult to get out of because they are helpless. Secrecy is the terrifying reality of child sexual abuse. They're alone with the offender. Sometimes the offender might make threats. More often, they will make promises to keep it a secret. Sometimes those promises might involve shaming the child or making the child feel guilty. But even if the child isn't told that this is a secret, even if the child is not told that they have to keep this quiet, they get that message. They get that message. Because the molester shuts the door. He pulls the shades down. He begins to talk in hushed tones. It's quiet. If a car pulls in the driveway, he'll jump up, pull up his pants. The message is no one should find out, even if they say no one is to find out. The context and the behavior of the molester speaks loud and clear. You are to tell no one. Now, the more aggressive of the molesters might even threaten the child. Threaten the child with punishment or violence. But that's not the typical way it happens. Typically it happens with the molester either telling them to keep it quiet or that it's somehow their fault, or the molester didn't mean it and he'll get in trouble and he'll be kicked out of the house and no one will pay the bills. And even if he doesn't say that, like I said, the kid knows that and gets that message inferentially. A recent study of non-disclosure rates, we're talking about secrecy here, and that means kids who are molested but they don't tell. It ranged among women between 33 and 92%, and among men between 42 and 85%. And that means people who are molested by their caregivers don't tell. They don't disclose. 86% of sexual assaults to adolescents went unreported in a recent study. 70% of the sample that was studied were told specifically they need to keep the abuse secret. So secrecy is a big part of intrafamilial child molestation. Helplessness, as I just explained to you, that's part of childhood, right? The very person who is molesting you is the same person who's supposed to care and nurture you. It's the same person who tells you, what you can wear to school, what you can dress up as Halloween, what you can do over your friend's house, whether you can have Xbox in your room, what you're going to wear to school the next day, whether you can go on a field trip. The key decision maker in your life, the one who controls you from the moment you wake up from bed till you go to sleep at night, is the molester, right? So you are truly helpless. Truly helpless. The typical response of small creatures to terror like this is to freeze and to do nothing. And the guilt about not protesting becomes self-perpetuating. It leads to more silence. And most of the molesters don't start out with a highly intrusive sexual act. Okay, first of all, in many cases it starts out with grooming. And grooming means reaching out to the child in little incremental ways, giving them rewards, giving them special attention, giving them a back rub, okay, engaging them in sexual ways, but in ambiguously sexual ways. Tickles, rubbing the body, things like that. Complimenting them, telling them they're special, you're my star. These kinds of acts, where they are not overtly sexual, are the beginnings of sexual abuse. And it is very tempting for these kids to embrace the special treatment, the preferential treatment, the rewards, okay, the extra $5, the something that he buys her at the mall that she really shouldn't get, being able to stay out late, not telling mom when she does something wrong. This kind of preferential special treatment and ambiguous, not so clear touching, rubbing, kissing, holding, creeping hands, that kind of touching goes on and on, and then the kid starts to feel guilty about it. And then the abuse becomes more intrusive. Then it becomes overtly sexual. It becomes fondling with the clothes off. Eventually it leads to penetration as they get older, and eventually sex acts both on the child and by the child on the perpetrator. But you can see what we mean by here, the child's guilt about not protesting leads to more silence. They are so conflicted and confused, especially when it's not directly sexual, but it feels weird and they kind of know he's doing it, but they can't be sure, and he does give them special treatment, and he does give them an extra $5, and didn't tell mom about this. The acceptance of that and the confusion about the behavior and the fact that they don't tell on him becomes self-perpetuating in that, well, I can't tell now. I'm going to get in trouble for this, that, or the other thing. And then what are they going to say? Why didn't I tell the first time he tickled me? Or why didn't I tell when he put his mouth on my chest? And eventually the child gets in deeper and deeper, and they feel, not always, but in many cases, they feel a lot of guilt about not protesting in the beginning. So how do they react to that? They continue to remain silent about it. Many victims report that saying no, they believe that saying no or somehow objecting would only have resulted in continued abuse and maybe even further harm. For example, many victims felt that if they said no, it was going to happen anyway. If they said no to taking out the trash, or they said no to going and change out of that skirt and go put a jeans on, bad things would happen when you crossed dad or stepdad. So in that context, saying no was not an option. So you have a secret scenario and you have a helpless scenario. There's no one to turn to. So kids feel trapped. That's entrapment. And they learn to cope. They learn to live with the molestation. This is called entrapment and accommodation. Because the abuse happens repeatedly, and because the kid feels so helpless that they have no one to turn to, or they in fact have no one to turn to, they have to figure out a way to go on living in this house with this man. So they figure out all kind of ways to accommodate. So it happens in secret. The kids by definition are helpless, so they're trapped. That's what entrapment is. And if you're trapped and you have to deal with something you can't control, you learn to live with it. And you respond by accommodating in a variety of ways. Okay? One of the things that makes the victim feel trapped is because they feel responsible for the well-being of the entire family. Especially the older kids. They think if they do tell, all hell's going to break loose, and it does. They're going to be blamed, and they are. And the family will become split up in some way, and it does. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But so kids accommodate. They figure out ways to go on living and deal with this. And I'll touch upon a few of those in a moment. Male victims are a whole nother set of problems, okay? They go through very similar dynamics, but they also have special social burdens placed on them. The male should be stronger. He should be able to resist. And the fact that he couldn't resist may suggest he's weak. Some boys think that it may be evidence that because they didn't object right away and it's male on male, that they're gay and they don't want to be perceived as being gay or homosexual. They feel that there's a stigma associated with that. So they couldn't possibly tell. Because if the world finds out about this, people will think that I'm weak or a homosexual. And to some males, many males, that can be stigmatizing and they don't want to be perceived as that. So they keep it quiet. But I'm going to focus on female victims, which are the vast majority of victims within the family. So kids accommodate, they may lie, they may run away, they may turn to drugs, they may make themselves unavailable. You know, sometimes they get involved in every school activity there is, right? They go to school activities in the morning before school starts. They're a member of the band, the chess club, they're a member of the math club, and they stay late after school. Why do you think they get involved in all these programs and they're at school all the time? Why is that a way of accommodating?
They're trying to figure out a way to not go home to the situation.
Precisely. So if you ain't home, you can't be molested, right? So the more you're out of the house, the less at risk you are. So you may see victims do that. Not all of them, but that's one strategy that some kids use. You know, they stay away from the guy in any way they can, especially when they get older, where they can stay after school and they can get involved in programs and things like that. I had kids once who, you know, it was obviously not effective whatsoever, but they tried to nail the door shut with a hammer and nails. And we went and took pictures of the nail holes where the girls tried, or siblings who nailed the door, attempted to nail the door shut to stop their stepfather from coming in the room drunk and molesting them. This is the really severe cases. These are psychological strategies. They may fragment, dissociate. They may even develop what's known as dissociative identity disorder. And dissociation is a way to get away from the molester in your mind. Sometimes kids report while they're being molested, they went somewhere else. They may count the holes in the ceiling as they look up. They may think about things that are pleasing or things that have nothing to do with what's happening to them. Another way to accommodate and to cope is to not be where you are at that very moment in your mind. That's a form of dissociation. Now, you can be pathologically or psychologically dissociated where you have a mental health issue, a mental illness develops, where you really have a major problem. But it helps. It helps when this is happening. But it doesn't have to be that severe. Many kids will report that they they go somewhere else. They're not there, as if they're hovering over their body, and some other human is being fondled or molested. And that's a psychological coping mechanism. They can be behavioral, staying late, wearing baggy clothes. Some kids do everything in their power, especially when they reach adolescence and they realize what human sexuality is all about. Some kids will engage in efforts to minimize their sexual attractiveness, again, by wearing baggy clothes, by looking, in their mind, sexually unattractive. And it rarely has any impact on the molest. You'll see when you read Jane Doe's narrative, it's as if Roland Summit, was Dr. Summit, who wrote this article, was hiding in the closet and watching her life from, the time she was 3 and 4 till the time she was a teenage girl. But it's not only Jane Doe. I've met hundreds of Jane Does in my career. Jane Doe is typical of a victim of family incest or family molestation. And you'll see, she just happened to express many of the coping mechanisms that kids use to get past the abuse and to get away from the offender. Most ongoing sexual abuse is never disclosed outside the family. And when it is disclosed, disclosing means when they told. Most kids who do decide to tell in bits and pieces. We call that fragmented disclosure or incremental disclosure. They may tell a little bit at a time. Sometimes they tell a little bit at a time just to test the waters, to see what's going to happen if they do tell. They may have had to perform acts of sexual penetration, fellatio on their stepdad. He may have had intercourse with them or performed sex acts, oral sex upon their bodies. And they'll tell that dad comes in her room and gets fresh with me. He's been doing it for a long time. What does that mean? He would come and he'd fondle, he'd grab my breasts. I don't know if he meant it or not. They'll be wishy-washy about the statement when many, many more intrusive things happen. But they're just getting a feel for how the adults around them are going to react. We call that testing the waters. Not all kids tell that way, but some do. They test the waters. And some will just tell you about the most intrusive act, or the one that they remember most, and they won't tell about all the others. So when they do tell, this is the next category, this is the D in She Doctor: secrecy, helplessness. The E is entrapment, you're trapped. Entrapment and accommodation. Accommodation is the things you do to deal with it. And this is probably a real poor analogy, but if the hot water ever went bad in your house and the hot water heater broke and you only had cold water, eventually you need to take a shower, and you figure out ways to take a shower in the cold water, right, and get by. Now, it's a very poor analogy, but it is an analogy in this sense that you figure out ways to do it and to live and go on and take a shower, right? You might go under the water for 2 seconds, jump back. You might figure out if I only wash this way or that way. There's all kinds of strategies you might come up with. And eventually, after a while, after the 3rd week, it's not so bad. You get used to it. You figure out how to take showers in cold water. And these kids get used to the molestation. They somehow compartmentalize it, and it's a little part of their life, and they learn to deal with it. And after a while, I don't want to say it's not so bad, but it's not as bad as the first times. And they go on living. And they do the things that most kids do, except this thing happens in secret in their homes. And they figure out a way to still go to school and have friends and do the things they do. Not all of them. Some of them have very serious problems in adolescence, which leads to them telling or not telling and developing mental health issues, suicidal ideation, cutting behaviors, anything to cry out without saying exactly what's going on. So, getting back, secrecy, helplessness, entrapment, and accommodation. When you do tell, it's delayed. It's months later, often years later, and very unconvincing, because you're like telling a little bit of it, and then you take some of it back, and people don't, people who are listening and the interviewers begin to notice inconsistencies. You might tell it differently the second time you told it to someone else. It's not very convincing. In fact, one of the major triggers for disclosure is family conflict, which I highlighted up there. A kid may have been abused since maybe 4 or 5 years old, and it may have been just touching for a couple of years and fondling. Then it may, as the child gets older, may have been more intrusive, involving penetration and other acts of oral sex and contact like that. And the child hits, they accommodate it. And then they're in their teenage years, and they begin to put this in perspective when they're a teenager now. They know 100% it's wrong. When you're 6 and 7, you really don't know what to make of that, right? But when you reach adolescence and you realize your, stepdad's 100% wrong, I should have told, but you go on living with it. And then, in many cases, there'll be a family conflict. Like, your father's going to take you up to camp this weekend. I can't take you up there, Mom will say. I'm not going with him to camp. No way. Well, I can't be there this weekend. He's driving you to camp. I'm not going with that scumbag. What did you call your father? You heard me. At 14, 15, they're beginning to rebel naturally, as many teens do, right? And the mother might misinterpret this rebellion as natural adolescent rebellion. You heard me, I'm not going there. You don't talk to your father like that. That's what he is. You go to your room. I'm not going to my room. F you, blah, blah, blah. They get into a screaming match, and she throws in that he's been having sex with me since I'm 6. Now, the mother is in no position to accept that this is true at that moment, okay? And in fact, this is the worst context of all to accept that this may be true. That you have a rebellious teen who's screaming and yelling and calling her mother names, and they get into a lockdown family argument. So when it does come out, sadly, the disclosure is unconvincing. On the one hand, a very typical trigger is a major family conflict. And on the other hand, that major family conflict causes the disclosure to be unconvincing. No one's going to buy it. She's just saying this to get out of this, that, or the other thing. And many of her behaviors as an adolescent, sleeping around with boys, smoking weed, not coming home on time, having a fresh mouth, many of those things may be a product of the molestation. So the very things that the perpetrator caused are used against the child, right? She comes home late, she's sleeping with boys, she's smoking pot, she don't mind her P's and Q's, she's got a fresh mouth. And now she says this, we're to believe this. It's certainly not a good environment to believe the child, especially the adolescent child. So you do get this kind of disclosure that arises out of family conflict sometimes, okay? And Summit writes about that as well. Sometimes it's discovered by a third party. Someone walks in, there's a love letter. Nowadays, we might discover text messages that father sent to daughters, stepfather sent to daughters, or uncles and the like. So somehow, somebody stumbles upon this. Mom's checking the cell phone because she thinks the girl's sleeping around with boys, and she sees text from her husband. What's this all about? Incidental discovery is another way it comes out. Sometimes it comes out when, especially with the younger kids, when programs come to the school and talk about boundaries and relationships and what's right and wrong. We don't talk about good touch or bad touch anymore, and I'll talk to you more about that, but that used to be a way that programs reached out to kids by using the description good touch or bad touch, and I'll talk a little bit about that next week. And sometimes teenagers disclose because they see that the father's paying extra special attention to their 7-year-old sibling, who's at the very age that they were when it first started. So while they never told for self-preservation, they never told to protect themselves, they may decide to tell now because they're concerned that he may be doing it to their little sister, and they don't want that to happen. They may have medical problems because of what happened, or they may disclose to a friend who they have a close friendship with. One of the cases I prosecuted about 5 years ago, maybe about 7 years ago now, And I'll tell you more about it next week, but it involved a woman who was, when she came to my office, she was 25 or 6 or 7 years old. She's in her mid-20s. And she disclosed, for the first time, well into adulthood, that her stepfather had molested her from 3 or 4 all the way up to within the past, her 23rd year, well into adulthood. When mom, she was about to get married, mom wanted Frank, the stepdad, to walk her down the aisle, like fathers do. They give away the bride. And she was adamant, he will not walk me down the aisle. What are you talking about? How could you say that about Frank? He's been good to us our whole lives. I didn't have any money, nothing. Frank came into our lives and we built a family. Right? How could you say that about him? I'm not doing it. I don't want him walking me down the aisle. Very emotional about it. And the mother, what do you mean, this and that? Boom. She tells what happened. And her older sister did the same thing to her, well into her adult years as well. Problem was we couldn't prosecute it because the statute of limitations had expired. But then I figured out a strategy to get Frank. That I saw a little loophole in the law, and I'll tell you about it next week. And I indicted him, I prosecuted him in a 4-month trial. Family conflict, okay? Medical problems. At the same time, this is what made me think of this case with KR. Most of her adolescence, they had an undiagnosable stomach ailment. She had an undiagnosable stomach ailment. She described it as feeling like it was glass crushed in her stomach. Crushed in her stomach. And they took her to doctors here and doctors in South Jersey and doctors all over the country, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with KR. Now, often, psychological traumas manifested physically, and we now know that it was real, it was happening, but they couldn't find anything diagnosable. But it was the terror that she experienced her entire childhood that caused her to have these physical sensations, which she described as the crushing of glass in her belly throughout most of her teenage years. Okay, and she wound up disclosing, and you know, he was eventually charged. And, you know, I'll tell you more about that next week. And after they tell, sadly, some of them take it all back. Because the very things that the perpetrator predicted, no one will believe you, you may have to go to foster care, your brothers and sisters will disown you, right? Happens. Exactly what the crystal ball dad had said would happen, happened. Okay? Everyone's disbelieving. She's called a whore and a slut and not worthy of belief, and a liar. Okay? The threats to the secrecy are true. So, as a martyr for the family, to make things the way they used to be before she told, they recant. They take it back and say, I made it all up for a variety of different reasons in an effort to put the family back where they were and return to normal. So you have recantation. Okay? And as I tell juries often when we try these cases, and I'll tell you why we try them next week, but there's nothing sadder in this whole wide world than a child who was molested her whole childhood and has to come into a courtroom and say what really happened never did. Nothing sadder than that. And I tell the jurors, and you'll see that right here this week. And maybe it happens in, research has told us, in about 20 to 25% of the cases, the kid will come back and try to take it all back and recant. But we'll pick up more on this next week. And you'll see when you read Jane Doe's statement that she was a denier. And she figured out every strategy in the book, and none of it worked. Not one attempt at preserving her dignity and protecting herself from her father worked. Because there's a total disparity of power. She was a little kid, he was a grown-up. So I'll see you next week.